Chapter 12. Policy Effects and Cost Shocks in the S/AD Model. You have 5 minutes to read summary, P262, and then, there will be a short quiz. Why does the aggregate demand curve slope downward and what makes it shift? 2. Why does the aggregate supply curve slope upward and what makes it shift? 3. Why is the long-run aggregate supply curve vertical? The aggregate demand curve has a negative slope primarily because of the interest rate effect, the consumption link, and the real wealth effect. The interest rate effect stems from the fact that higher prices lead to increased money demand and increased interest rates. The rise in interest rates causes a decrease in investment and consumption, which, in turn, leads to lower aggregate output. The real wealth effect stems from the fact that an increase in prices means that the purchasing power of money holdings and the market value of other assets decreases, which leads to a decrease in consumption and output. The aggregate demand curve will shift if any of the components of aggregate demand increase. This could happen in response to a change in government policy variables. The primary reason for the positive slope of the S-curve is that wages and input prices tend to lag output prices in the short run. Cost shocks, economic growth, public policy, lack of investment, natural disasters, bad weather, and wars can all cause shifts in the S-curve. The long-run S-curve is vertical because short-run increases in aggregate output beyond potential GDP cause wages and input prices to rise. This causes the short-run S-curve to shift leftward. Aggregate output declines back to the level of potential GDP. Four. What are the short-run and long-run effects of demand changes? 5. What are the effects of supply shocks? In the short run, increases in aggregate demand will increase both real GDP and the price level. In the long run, however, continued increases in aggregate demand will result in increasing rates of inflation and decreasing rates of output growth. Supply, cost, shocks cause aggregate supply to decrease. The results are decreased aggregate output and higher inflation. This situation, known as stagflation, is difficult to counter with expansionary fiscal or monetary policy. Aggregate demand is the total demand for goods and services in the economy. At all points along the AD curve, both the goods market and the money market are in equilibrium. At every point along the aggregate demand curve, the aggregate quantity of output demanded is exactly equal to planned aggregate expenditure. Equilibrium condition requires Y equals C plus I plus G. An increase in the quantity of money supplied at a given price level shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. An increase in government purchases or a decrease in net taxes shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. The aggregate supply, as curve is a graph that shows the relationship between the aggregate quantity of output supplied by all firms in an economy and the overall price level. In the short run, the aggregate supply curve, the price/output response curve, has a positive slope. At low levels of aggregate output, the curve is fairly flat. As the economy approaches capacity, the curve becomes nearly vertical. At capacity, the curve is vertical. Macroeconomists focus on whether or not the economy as a whole is operating at full capacity. As the economy approaches maximum capacity, firms respond to further increases in demand only by raising prices. When the economy is operating at low levels of output, an increase in aggregate demand is likely to result in an increase in output with little or no increase in the overall price level. There must be a lag between changes in input prices and changes in output prices, otherwise the aggregate supply, price/output response, curve would be vertical. Wage rates may increase at exactly the same rate as the overall price level if the price level increase is fully anticipated. Most input prices, however, tend to lag increases in output prices. A cost shock, or supply shock, is a change in costs that shifts the aggregate supply, as curve. The equilibrium price level is the point at which the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves intersect. P0 and Y0 correspond to equilibrium in the goods market and the money market and a set of price/output decisions on the part of all the firms in the economy. Costs lag behind price level changes in the short run, resulting in an upward sloping S-curve. Costs and the price level move in tandem in the long run, and the S-curve is vertical. Output can be pushed above potential GDP by higher aggregate demand. The aggregate price level also rises. When output is pushed above potential, there is upward pressure on costs, and this causes the short run S-curve to the left. Costs ultimately increase by the same percentage as the price level, and the quantity supplied ends up back at Y0. Y0 represents the level of output that can be sustained in the long run without inflation. It is also called potential output or potential GDP. AD can shift to the right for a number of reasons, including an increase in the money supply, a tax cut, or an increase in government spending. AD can shift to the right for a number of reasons, including an increase in the money supply, a tax cut, or an increase in government spending. On the steep portion of the S-curve, expansionary policy does not work well. The multiplier is close to zero. When the economy is operating near full capacity, an increase in AD will result in an increase in the price level with little increase in output. If the S-curve is vertical in the long run, neither monetary policy nor fiscal policy has any effect on aggregate output. In the long run, the multiplier effect of a change in government spending or taxes on aggregate output is zero. Inflation is an increase in the overall price level. Sustained inflation occurs when the overall price level continues to rise over some fairly long period of time. Demand pull inflation is inflation initiated by an increase in aggregate demand. Cost push, or supply side, inflation is inflation caused by an increase in costs. Stagflation occurs when output is falling at the same time that prices are rising. One possible cause of stagflation is an increase in costs.
단지 이제 어제처럼 외부 소리가 들어가도록 이제 만들었지.
Cost shocks are bad news for policymakers. The only way to counter the output loss is by having the price level increase even more than it would without the policy action. In terms of the AD/S diagram, an increase in inflationary expectations shifts the S curve to the left. Hyperinflation is a period of very rapid increases in the price level. An increase in G with the money supply constant shifts the AD curve from AD0 to AD1. This leads to an increase in the interest rate and crowding out of planned investment.